Story about this little boy. And this little boy loved to go out to play. But there were mean boys who lived in this camp. They would run after him, they would fight him, they would make him cry, they would rip up all his clothes, and the poor boy would go home to his grandmother because he was an orphan. He had no mother and no father, so he lived with his grandmother. And his poor old grandmother would take her needle and thread and she would sew his clothes all back together again. And the little boy would put on his clothes, he would go off to play. The mean boys would run after him. They would fight him, they would make him cry, they would rip up all his clothes, and his poor old grandmother would have to sew them all back together again. And one day, when the little boy came home, there was a little seal that somebody had caught for them. You know, for thousands of years, my people, the Inuit, survived mostly because of one animal, and that animal is a seal. And more specifically, it's the bearded seal. Because the bearded seal is the most common animal in the north. And we eat the meat. We use the fat in our stone seal oil lamps, our kudliks, to heat our igloos, to cook with, and for light in the winter. And we make clothing out of the skins of the seal. These wonderful, boots called kamik that are waterproof and warm and light. And we make tools and toys out of the bones. So we use the whole seal. And we have survived on this one animal for thousands of years. And anyway, there was a little seal that somebody had caught for them, and it was lying on the floor. And his grandmother said, "I would like you to skin that seal." So the little boy took a knife. He started to skin the seal. His grandmother said, be careful, don't put any holes in the skin." So very, very carefully, the little boy skinned the seal. And when he was all finished, his grandmother said, "I would like you to take the seal skin and pull it over your head, and I would like you to put your head in that pail of water." There was a great big pail of water on the floor. So the little boy took the seal skin. He pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath and he stuck his head into this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could. And when his lungs hurt, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, "Do it again." So he took another deep breath, and he stuck his head back in this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going like this. You know what seals look like? They look like this. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, and when his lungs were just about to break, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, "Do it again." So he took another deep breath and he stuck his head back in this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going like, and when he was just about to drown, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, "Do it again." Every time he lifted his head, his grandmother would say, "Do it again." He would take a deep breath and he would stick his head back into this pail of water. And after a while, he could keep his head underwater for a long, 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 long time. And an old man way up north in a place called Kugajuk explained it to me this way. He would keep his head underwater so long, he would move the sun. And finally, his grandmother was satisfied that he could keep his head underwater long enough. And she said, "I would like you to go down to the beach. And when you're walking to the beach, make sure nobody sees you. And when you get to the water's edge, I would like you to take the seal skin and pull it over your head and jump into the water and go for a swim and come up right in front of all your mean friends who are playing on the beach." And sure enough, all the mean boys were playing on the beach. The little boy took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head, and he walked down to the beach, make sure nobody saw him. And when he got there, he took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he jumped into the water. He swam underwater, and he came up right in front of all the mean boys who were playing on the beach. And the mean boys looked at him, and they said, "Hey, there's a little seal." And they all ran up. They grabbed their kayaks, their long skinny skin boats. They put their kayaks in the water, they hopped, and they took their long paddles. And they started paddling, following the little seal. The little seal would go down underwater, and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And then he would go down, and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And the mean boys who fought him and made him cry and ripped all his clothes, they were paddling their kayaks, following along behind him. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And after a while, they were way out at sea. And when they were way out at sea, when the little seal came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Ano riga na, ano riga kaili, unga, unga." And then he'd go down again. And he would swim a little bit farther out, and when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Ano riga na, ano riga kaili, unga, unga." And then he'd go down again. And he would swim a little bit farther out, and when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Where is my wind? I want my wind." And he would make a crying sound like a little baby. Well, well. People say the weather that was on the day you were born is your very own weather. And that is why, if you were born on a sunny day, usually the sun shines on your birthday. If you were born on a rainy day, usually it rains on your birthday. And this little boy was born on a very, very windy day. And he was calling the weather that was on the day he was born. "Where is my wind? I want my wind." And he made a crying sound like a little baby. Well, well. Just like the day he was born. The wind heard him, and it started to come. It got windier and windier and windier, and before long there were huge waves in the water. And the kayaks with all the mean boys were going up and down in the big waves. And sometimes a giant wave came and it would flip the kayaks over. And before long, there was only one person left. That person was Kivio. Now Kivio was very strong. He was really good with his paddle. He paddled his kayak on and on, going up and down in the big waves. And when a giant wave came and flipped his kayak over, he would roll it back up using his paddle. He was really, really good with his paddle. And he kept on going. No matter how cold and wet and tired he got, he never gave up. He paddled his kayak in the big storm, and every time it flipped over, he would roll it back up. And finally, after a long time, the wind stopped, and the sea became really, really still again. And Kiviok was so tired, he put his paddle on his lap, he put his head on his chest, and he fell asleep. He slept for a long time. When he woke up, he sat up in his kayak. He looked around, all around, but there was nothing but water. He was way out in the middle of the ocean. And because he was way out in the middle of the ocean, he couldn't see any land anywhere. And because he couldn't see land, he didn't know which way to go. And while he was sitting there, he started to think about some strange and wonderful things. And one of the things he thought about was this little feather he had on the back of his coat. You see, ever since he was a tiny little boy, his mother, see, I told you he had a mother. His mother always sewed a little feather on the back of his coat. It was a feather from a little bird called a sowcock. And a sowcock is a little brown bird that swims in tiny ponds. And while it's swimming, it goes around and round and round and round in circles. And while it's going around, it goes like this. They're funny little birds, and I love to watch them. And he had this little feather on the back of his coat. And he always wondered what it was for. And while he was sitting there, a little bird came. A little white bird, a snow bunting. It landed on his kayak. It looked at Kiviok and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So he started to follow the little bird. He paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon, like a little piece of thread. And he thought it was land, so he paddled his kayak toward it. But after a while, it disappeared, and Kiviok said, just disappeared again. Must have been a big wave. And the little bird looked at him again and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So he started to follow the little bird again, and he paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon, like a little piece of thread. And he thought it was land, so he paddled his kayak toward it. And this time, it didn't disappear. It got thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, and Kiviok landed his kayak way over on the other side of the ocean, in this strange place. And when I was a little boy, and my grandmother told me that story, for the longest time, I didn't know the story had an ending because I always fell asleep. Like that story? Well, Kiviok ended up on the other side of the ocean, and it was a strange place. You know, his kayak was full of water because he'd been out in this big storm for days, and his clothes were all wet, his boots were full of water. So he pulled up his kayak, he turned it over and poured all the water out, and then he started walking, looking for a place where he might lie down and take his boots off and put them up to dry. And he was just walking up a hill, and over on the other side he saw this giant clutch of giant spiders. And they started to chase him, and he had to run away. And he ran down to his kayak, threw it in the water, hopped in, and paddled his way around this big point of land and landed on the other side. And he started looking for a place where he might lie down and, dry his boots. When he saw this strange igloo on top of a hill, it had no top. And he walked up to it and looked inside. There was a giant bumblebee sitting on the bed, and it was cooking some strange stuff in the cooking pot. And he had all these, adventures, and he got homesick, so he started traveling, trying to find his way home. And while Kiviok was trying to find his way home, it seems like he traveled through every part of the north, because there are stories about him everywhere. If you go to Siberia, you can hear stories about Kiviok. If you go to Alaska, you can hear stories about Kiviok. We have Kiviok stories all across the northern Canada, and there are Kiviok stories in Greenland too. And one day I was talking to a bunch of people down in Toronto at the Harbourfront Centre, and when I was finished, this guy came up, and he was a blonde man, and he said, "That's a strange word." And I said, "What word is that?" He said, "Kiviok." And I said, "What do you mean it's a strange word?" He said, "We have a word just like that." And I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Finland." And he said, in Finnish, they have a word which sounds just like Kiviok, and it means stone man. So if you go back far enough in Finnish history, you might find stories about this very same person. Of course, Finland is a northern country, so maybe people went over there and told them stories about Kibio. Well, anyway, those are the stories that I heard when I was a little kid. And it was absolutely wonderful until one day when I was 7 years old. And it was in early fall, and we were standing down on the beach, a bunch of us kids, and we heard the sound. And it stopped. And somebody said, "Did you hear that sound?" "Yeah, I heard." "What is it?" And we looked and looked and looked, and a kid we call Avesi, which I later discovered his real name was Andriasi, but we call him Avesi. He had very sharp hearing, and he said, "Did you hear that sound?" And we said, "Yeah, what is it?" And Avesi looked around. He had very sharp eyes, and he said, "It's an airplane." And we looked and looked, and just above the horizon we saw this tiny little speck, and it was an airplane. And it came, and then it landed down on the sea, on the water. And it floated up, with the propeller going, and it landed right in front of us, on the beach. And this airplane took a bunch of us kids. And we got into the airplane, and we closed the doors, and it was smelly in there like gasoline. And and we got into this thing, and the pilot pushed the airplane off down into the water and started up the engine,